We left a question or two hanging last time. We asked the question, do we have to throw out truth if we're going to be inclusive and welcoming? Can we find a way forward that is totally loving and welcoming, but non-judgmental or alienating? We're going to talk about that in this podcast. This is Dechurched. Welcome. So your story no longer fits with the narrative being told in your faith community. You've left the building, but you still want to keep walking with Jesus somehow. We talked last time that it's a bit like being left at the side of the road, beaten down with your questions, doubts, or pains. And then that just gets exacerbated by the passers-by, the community you thought that you could rely on. So how do we get up and we start walking? Let's firstly have a wider view of God's love. We need also, though, people who are like story companions, like the Samaritan, people who will come alongside us and say, it's okay, who will pick us up out of the dirt and help us feel human again, who will restore our faith in humanity, give us a sense of a new identity as someone maybe part of the wider human family, and maybe even our faith in this God whom we seem to have left behind when we left our particular tribe. On this channel, we want to try and be that as much as we can, story companions, fellow travelers in our brokenness. But let's have a think about this question of how truth and openness works. There was an anthropologist called Heibert who came up with the concept of centered and bounded set. With bounded set, he described it like this. We put frames around pictures. We have neatly defined notes in music. We have a lawn for grass, and all other growing things are called weeds. We have an instinct as humans to define, to segregate, and delineate. This goes here and not there. This fits and this doesn't. Heibert called this a bounded set or a well-formed set. You have a center, and that's surrounded by a border, a sharp boundary. And he points out that in cultures with bounded sets, they often think in terms of opposites: rich, poor, friends, enemies, good, bad, kingdom of God, kingdom of darkness. Bounded sets are typical of Western cultures. In Western culture, we like to categorize things neatly. Animal, it's animal, vegetable, or mineral. I saw a school exam question the other day. It was a biology exam, and the question was, what do you call the system that classifies different humans? And a student had put racism. We like neat categories, but I've traveled in many parts of the world, and these categories aren't universal. Many cultures, for example, have sliding notes in music. My singing is a bit like that sometimes, but that's more by accident than design. But in the Western church, where there is a mentality of the bounded set, Christians are either Christians or not, saved or not, said the prayer or not. And because we can't look at the heart, we look for external evidence based very often on a particular set of criteria. So we have membership, in or out, baptized or not. Often viewing any idea that comes from another faith as automatically false, or at least under suspicion because of who is saying it and where they come from. Fearful of letting the world seep into the church. But of course, if the devil said 1 and 1 equals 2, does that make it wrong? Speaker and wit Tony Campolo once said this, you know, you don't have to be a Baptist to get into heaven, but why take a chance? Where I grew up, being a Protestant was a step up the ladder closer to glory. Catholic less so, other religions even less so, and we didn't even mention the atheists. But the question Jesus keeps asking us is, how big is God's love? Think of all the millions of people who weren't privileged to be brought up with your background, with my background. Not born in my particular people group at this particular time with that particular denomination. There has to be a way that the community of God reflects this massive, large love of God and welcomes the outsider. Bounded set is in or out. So what's the alternative? Well, Heibert talks about centered sets. Centered set is moving in a direction around a center, towards, around, away from. But everyone is related in some form or other to the center. Boundaries are more fuzzy. It's not about being in or out, but being on a journey. There's still a center, but we're all somewhere a little bit on a kind of continuum. So we would operate in that setting on an assumption of God's welcome. And when we do that, they may not look like it, but that stranger that you see at the side of the road just turned out to be an angel in disguise. I love those TV shows where they sometimes get some ultra right-wing nationalist and ask him to have a DNA test. And they do the DNA test and then they present to him the results, and he discovers that he's got African American blood in him or Native American blood in him. And you see the neat categories exploding in his mind. An African friend of mine said, "There are no white folks, just various shades of pink merging into caramel." Now, when we start to talk about bounded and centered set, it's easy to default back into either or thinking. Even with this, we swing the other way and say, that's right, it's all about becoming fuzzy and throwing off all truth and gathering in a kind of hippie circle and singing Kumbaya. No, there is a time for truth exploring. But Jesus gives plenty of indicators that the neat descriptions and boundaries that humans put on things need to be a lot more elastic and expansive and wider than we imagine. We need both centered and bounded set thinking. But sometimes, because of the human tendency to create neat categories that exclude rather than include, we need to bias in a certain direction for a while. And what bias is that? Well, I would suggest towards hospitality, towards welcome, towards inclusion. Let's try that for a few hundred years and see how that works out. Aesop's fable, one of my favorites of his fables, is the story of the wind and the sun who are having a debate. The wind looked down and said to the sun, I can get the man down there to take his coat off. And he blew and blew, but all that happened was the man pulled the coat around him more tightly. The sun said, I can do it. And the sun just warmed up, and he just gently warmed the man until eventually he was so warm that he took his coat off. I suppose you could have a number of morals from that story, but here's what I take from it. It's not how hard you blow, but the best way to affect people is by warmth and love. There is something intrinsically attractive that will draw people. It's not about wind and blustering on about truth. It's about love. By this will all people know that you're my disciples, if you love one another. Not if you blow hard and rant about the truth or see yourself as manning the border patrols, but love. God's love is bigger than our neat prescriptive language after all. Remember what we said last time. Truth is a person. Truth is a person. What do you think? Let's have a conversation. Join us on our Facebook page. But let me finish with a quote. Jesus was into a process of transformation more than a belonging system. This is a centered and bounded set, this discussion going on right here in this quote. He was into a process of transformation more than a belonging system. For example, he says lovingly to an inquisitive scribe, "You are not far from the kingdom of God," affirming his particular stage on the journey without telling him to go all the way right now. He wanted searchers more than settlers, prophets more than priests, honest journeys more than gatherings of the so-called healthy. If you're on a journey, it's okay, let's walk it together. This space is one of welcome. Let's keep traveling together as the Dechurched.